Denver Broncos wide receiver Courtland Sutton is the team's top offensive option going into 2024, but his time with the team might be up here in the near future. And if that's the case, who will step up behind him? We continue our Broncos training camp position preview here on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country. A special shout out to all the everydayers out there who tune in and make us your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss out what's going on with your favorite team every single day all year long. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. And look, we're continuing our Broncos training camp position previews. We're focusing on the offense here until we build up to the defensive side here. A lot of questions at a lot of positions, but also a lot of questions here at the wide receiver position, Sayre, because Courtland Sutton is the team's top wide receiving option this upcoming season. But there's so much uncertainty about what's going to happen, whether or not there's going to be a contract extension or whether or not this year or maybe next year could be the final year of him in town. Regardless, he's their best offensive player. Will he remain wide receiver one for this team is the biggest question we have here at this position.
You really hope so, because he's coming off a year in which he had a career best 10 touchdown catches and played arguably the best that we've ever seen as a Bronco, which is saying something because in 2019 he made the Pro Bowl and he was outstanding. But I mean, just when you look at quarterback rating when targeted, those 10 touchdowns, everything about last season for Sutton just felt like, you know, he was more of a difference maker. And certainly he put up numbers in 2019 and he was great in 2019. That's when he kind of earned the reputation for not just being a 50-50 receiver downfield, but 60-40, because the advantage Courtland Sutton when the ball was in the air thrown his direction. And it felt like that guy was finally back in 2023, didn't it? With just a couple of years after, you know, the injury in 2020, didn't quite look the same in 2021, although the whole offense was kind of out of sorts. I think 2022 was the peak of sort of the frustration over whether or not he was going to live up to the contract or whether or not he was going to be able to become that guy or rediscover that guy that we saw in 2019. It certainly felt like 2023 was the emergence that kind of allowed everybody to exhale, like, all right, he's still there. And so there's a reason why he held out of the voluntary OTAs this offseason. And there's also a reason why he came back for mandatory OTAs, because he understands his role in the team. He wants to play that role on the team. He wants to be in the Broncos Ring of Fame. I think in order for that to happen, Cody, he's got to remain this team's number one option going forward.
Well, and I think for any quarterback, whether it's Bo Nix, Jarrett Stidham, or Zach Wilson for that matter, I mean, having a wide receiver like Courtland Sutton is huge. If I'm not mistaken, Sayre, I think when we look at the entire AFC West, Courtland Sutton might be the longest withstanding player from like all of the teams, right? Because no more Keenan Allen or Mike Williams inside the Los Angeles Chargers. Devontae Adams is obviously freshly new relative to, you know, the AFC West in comparison, having played all those years in Green Bay with Aaron Rodgers. So for me, I look at where Courtland's at. He is like the lone wolf in terms of, you know, the top receivers inside the AFC West in terms of how teams viewed it. Like I think if you ask the Kansas City Chiefs, you asked Locked on Chiefs, Locked on Raiders, Locked on Chargers, who's the Broncos' best wide receiver? They would tell you it's Courtland Sutton. That's the one guy that they consistently talk about when we do our crossover episodes there. So now he's obviously looking to get some more money. We'll see if they find a way to come to terms there. I liked how at the last day of like mandatory minicamp or OTAs, when he did report there, Sean Payton said that basically he and Courtland Sutton, they had like a campfire conversation. They sat down and, you know, for Courtland, when he did his presser with the media in the offseason, you know, he said, I want to feel like I'm part of the game plan. Like I want to be a big part of it going forward. Sean Payton reaffirmed that the next day by saying, look, you know, we sat down and had a campfire conversation with him and said he's very much part of the game plan, a big part of it going forward. You talk about consistency from the receiver room, really outside of Tim Patrick. I'd say Courtland has been probably the consistent guy, even though he's had stretches of, okay, well, he didn't have as many yards, he didn't have as many touchdowns. There's different situations that impacted, obviously, the outlook of the Broncos offense, and in particular, production in the wide receiver room, where it looked like Tim Patrick might be the one guy who's really kind of QB proof. But I think that you also saw in games where Courtland didn't play, it's like, the Broncos, could you imagine if they had a guy like Courtland Sutton out there playing? Like, there were many times, like that Chargers game, like if it wasn't for little Jordan Humphrey's touchdown catch and run that he had, I don't know where Denver's at in that game offensively last season. And obviously he returned in that final game against the Raiders, suffered an ankle injury in that game. Him and Jarrett Stidham were off in terms of their connection and chemistry, not having a lot of time to work together. That's something that they've been trying to build up. And obviously I think we know this too. After the 4th of July weekend, the receivers all got together with the quarterbacks that, they're throwing, they're getting together. That's important for these guys to get that chemistry right before the start of training camp. But I can't help but wonder, okay, if this is Courtland Sutton, for example, he's got 2 years left on his deal. If there could be a chance that this could be his last season in Denver, hypothetically speaking, I think when you look at all the teams that had trade interest in Courtland that wanted him, and the Broncos' unwillingness to part ways with him, that's got to say something, right? So where's this game of tug of war really going to end between the two sides? That's a huge question. I don't think you can argue, though, having him on the field for any of these quarterbacks is going to be big, not just for the wide receiver room, but also for the quarterback competition itself.
It is, because advantage to the quarterback when he's out there on the field, right? He is like you said, the Broncos' top option. So to me, I don't know how this ultimately gets resolved. It sounded like Courtland was both optimistic about it, but also like there was kind of a wedge as of mandatory minicamp. So we'll see if anything gets resolved here before training camp begins. But to me, the Broncos have decided what hill they're dying on. Like, they could have traded Sutton. They could have got something valuable in return for him. Like, you see a lot of speculative articles out there as the content mill churns that people say, well, the Broncos should take whatever they can get for Sutton because they need picks for the future and this and that. And the other. I just feel like he's much more valuable if, let's say what we think Bo Nix is going to start. If Bo Nix is starting, like, you want Sutton out there at this point. Who cares about a 4th or 5th round pick? I mean, at best, like, is that what the Broncos would get, a 4th or 5th at this point? And people think that would be good value for Sutton as opposed to having him on the field at a team-friendly price. I mean, they might be able to fudge around some money and give him some more guaranteed cash or something, but his cap hits are pretty favorable to the team. The cash value, the average annual value, it's all benefiting the team right now. So why would they just get rid? Cody, they modified so much else on this roster over the course of the offseason. You cut Russell Wilson, you cut Justin Simmons, you let Josie Jewell go, you trade Jerry Jeudy, you do all these different things. They didn't do that just so they could eventually also trade Courtland Sutton. They did all that so they could keep Courtland Sutton, so they could keep Garrett Bowles. So I just think it would be so weird if they did anything like that, if they got rid of him at this point. But now, like you said, could end up being his last year with the team, but it's a valuable and important year for a young quarterback.
I like all the points that you just made about the moves they made in the offseason, because if he were going to be traded, it would have already happened by now. So that conversation, I feel like we can move on from. I don't even think that a team is going to try to trade for him at the trade deadline. They may be interested, but at this point, I don't think Denver will look to part ways. Courtland's going to be a big part of what they want to do this upcoming season. And if it is Bo Nix, I can already tell you, like, it was nice seeing at practice the last day of mandatory minicamp, Courtland Sutton running around routes and putting his arm around Bo Nix and walking with him and talking with him in the red zone period. Like, that was a cool thing to see. Not to read too much into it, but I mean, Courtland did say Bo has an aura about him. So we'll see if that can continue to build throughout training camp here as it approaches in the month of July. But not only is Courtland Sutton an important piece of the Broncos offense, they have a ton of wide receivers who are vying for opportunities to get reps. We'll take a look at every other player on this roster and tell you what they bring to the table here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos Country, today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is brought to you by our friends over there at the Game Time app. And Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. And prices on the Game Time app, they actually go down the closer that it gets to the first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. Not only can you buy MLB tickets, but you can buy tickets to your favorite events that are going on near you, whether there's a big concert coming into town or you want to buy Broncos tickets for this upcoming season, Game Time, they have you covered inside the app. Last minute deals where you can save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. Personally, I love the seat views where you get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy, so you know exactly what the vantage point is going to look like. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
The Denver Broncos may finally have enviable depth at the wide receiver position in 2024. Cody and I are going to break down every single player at this position, what they bring to the table on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But want to say thank you and give a shout out to all of you that make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, free and available anywhere that you listen to podcasts, as well as on YouTube, where you can watch the show and engage with other members of Broncos Country. And go ahead and hit subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, or on YouTube, or both if you haven't already. Cody and I greatly appreciate that as we ramp up towards another new Denver Broncos season. And if you're not already, you'll also want to get on Locked On Sports Today on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, something that's curated for you, the fan, the listener, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. There's a lot to unpack in the depth for the wide receiver position of the Denver Broncos in 2024. And finally, we're talking about depth. We're not talking about a depth chart. It's a very different situation when you're talking about guys that have actually proven they could play, a healthy room, guys that have stepped up, guys that have practiced well. Cody, you and I were talking before recording this show, just kind of like, man, it's going to be tough to make cuts this year, barring injury. And of course, knock on wood, we don't ever want to see guys get injured, things like that. We want guys to stay. You want the Broncos to have to make tough cuts. You don't want it to be well, I guess they're going to have to go sign somebody. That they were doing that last year when they signed a couple guys to the practice squad. The depth was so bad that they had to bring in guys from other teams that were cut to provide that depth. So finally, we're talking about the opposite. It's a great problem to have in 2024.
Well, if anyone's been a longtime listener of Locked On Broncos since Sayre has joined the show, Sayre for many years has been adamant about the Broncos need to bring in receivers. Well, they have an arsenal of guys here, really starting off here with the return of Tim Patrick. Let's talk about this. What is he bringing to the table? Obviously, a veteran presence, which Sean Payton talked about this offseason. Tim's been looking good. I mean, people that have followed me on social media have seen my video captures of him running routes. Like, Tim looks good. He participated in team drills for the first time during mandatory minicamp. So I don't think there's going to be limitations in training camp, though I will think that we'll probably see like his usage maybe minimized a little bit to where you just want to be smart, right? Because 2 years in a row, Tim has gone down in training camp. So the Broncos are going to be very, very smart with him. I think we already know what we're getting with Tim. You're getting reliability, consistency. It may take some time for him maybe to get back to who he was. But then again, like so far in practice, like I think in training camp, considering if he stays healthy, how does he do in one-on-ones? How does he do in those, team drills 11 on 11 with full pads? I think we'll see a lot more of the old Tim Patrick come back around. He's no stranger to overcoming serious injury. I mean, he suffered one of the worst injuries you could ever suffer at the college level, came back with a vengeance from that. Not necessarily worried about him. He's got a good head on his shoulders. Tim is obviously a guy who's safe. Then obviously, Sayre, the Broncos brought in Josh Reynolds this offseason. What do you think he's going to bring to the table for them?
Well, you mentioned Tim Patrick being a veteran out there. Josh Reynolds, another veteran. Somewhat of a surprising signing considering how young the Broncos have been going this offseason. But Josh Reynolds by no means is walking around with a cane or a walker out there. I mean, he's not that old. He's 29, I believe, and he's bringing that veteran presence to the team. He knows how to get open. He's got a bigger frame than people give him credit. A nice catch radius, really good speed, can work the middle of the field. Chain mover. I mean, Cody, when we talked about Courtland Sutton, we talked about quarterback rating when targeted. Josh Reynolds was up there among the best receivers in top 12 in the league last year in terms of quarterback rating when targeted by Jared Goff there in Detroit. So a really important acquisition for this team to provide this depth that we're talking about, and that, like you said, I've been clamoring for years on this show, just because we've seen how many times, time and time again, it's been proven the Broncos have gone deep into seasons with terrible wide receiver play. No offense to the guys that have been undrafted and worked their way to the roster and stepped up in those situations. But we talked about it. It's the difference between Josh Reynolds and Kendall Hinton for significant snaps that we're saying. And I don't mean to keep calling Kendall out. And he's a good dude, I'm sure, and obviously worked really hard to get where he did. But it's just a huge difference when you have a proven guy like this. How about Marvin Mims, too, stepping up in terms of his second year in the NFL, bigger role with Jerry Jeudy gone. He's going to be an important X factor for this team.
Yeah, and you can make the argument he's the fastest wide receiver on the field. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be some guys that will debate that, and I'm sure that's going to be I'm sure that is a topic of conversation inside the receiver room here. But the thing about Marvin is he's really just attacked this offseason, his preparation. He's looked good in OTAs. He's looked good in the mini camp practices. And we're talking about, I mean, Sayre, no more talking about the end around double reverse sweeps, the jet sweeps that we saw last year. Like, really, like, Marvin's good, but like, let's stop using Marvin in this way and actually throw him the football. It seems like from what we've seen in OTAs, we've seen in minicamp, Sean Payton understands, like, and he's been now open about it. We need to find a way to get him the football more. Marvin is one of those guys that did see more targets, more looks. You saw him blow behind a couple of defenders for a 55-yard touchdown during OTAs. You love to see that there. I think we are going to see a little bit more of that downfield presence here from Marvin. But I would say in terms of provenness, we've already talked about the three most proven guys, Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick, Josh Reynolds. Marvin is now in a tier where he's really going to have to try to figure out his identity as a player this upcoming season. And I think last year it wasn't his fault. It was more so the touches in front of him, the circumstances, quarterback play. I know there was the controversy of him saying, he doesn't throw me the ball. I know that was like heard or broadcasted by a fan at a stadium when he was signing autographs, but water under the bridge, a young guy being frustrated. Marvin's going to have a big role here. But speaking of a young guy and maybe a big role, Troy Franklin, it's even combined Devon Vele in this. Well, I mean, Sayre, the Broncos' 2 rookie draft picks from this year, they're still players who can contribute massively if put in the right position.
Well, and we know that injuries do happen, from time to time, whether it's 1 week, 2 weeks, or a significant stretch of time. I think we're going to see Troy Franklin have to play a pretty big role at some point this season. Well, like I said, if it's even just a couple of games, and the Broncos believe a lot in him, a second round grade, according to Sean Payton, on a guy that they got near the top of the 4th round. So Troy Franklin has that chemistry with Bo Nix dating back to their time at Oregon. It was interesting. We didn't hear a ton about him at OTAs, but that doesn't really matter. I think that, when we get to training camp preseason, we're going to start to see the intentional involvement in him in the offense. And that's going to be fascinating. Devon Vele is a guy whose name did pop up early on at rookie minicamp. And certainly as the OTAs progressed, he's a big body receiver, older rookie. Kind of felt like an interesting pick there later in the draft, but the Broncos, and Sean Payton has said this, they see some similarities in his game to what Tim Patrick brings to the table. And that, the story arc of Tim Patrick took a lot of time. So I wouldn't be surprised if Devon Vele, even though he is 26 as a rookie this year, I wouldn't be surprised if he was kind of put on the practice squad, maybe shuffled up and down, but he's got that big body. He's physical. He can get open over the middle of the field, and he can create, create with his body type in the red zone, create some separation at the catch point. So I like the 2 rookies for the Denver Broncos, but there's other guys that those rookies are competing with who have been around now, Cody, for a couple of years, or at least all of last season. Let's talk about some guys like David Sills, who you had noted as one of the bigger OTA standouts.
Yeah, look, there's so many guys at this position group. We're probably going to have to go a little bit rapid fire here to get through everybody in a timely manner. I'll start off with David Sills. I mean, just a technician, right? Consistently. He's not going to blow you away with his speed. He's not going to blow you away with like explosive athletic ability, but this is a guy who's a technician as a route runner. He does things to a T, how the coaching staff wants him to, and he seemingly catches everything that's thrown his way. He's a reliable guy. And I think that when you factor in all the different body types that go on in this Broncos offense in terms of wide receiver, the guys we've talked about, Sills is a guy that I think could be under the radar this upcoming season.
I think so too, Cody. And I think also when you talk about Jalen Virgil, another guy who kind of flies under the radar because of the fact that, well, he didn't play last year. He got injured in the preseason, but he could be a huge factor in the return game. There's only one former first round pick on this wide receiver unit, Cody. That's Philip Dorsett. Broncos had him on last year. They cut him earlier this offseason only to bring him back just because of a procedural move. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not he can compete. Let's bring it home with a couple of other guys who might be the most likely beyond anyone that we've talked about to potentially crack this 53-man roster.
Well, I mean, little Jordan Humphrey, you look at his body of work. He kind of came on strong late last year. I mean, I think the one trait you can say he's really good at is a blocker, right? And that's something that Sean Payton, the receivers, they want guys who are willing to block, engage in blocking. Little Jordan Humphrey had that impressive 54-yard catch and run touchdown and, high effort play there. But the question is he kind of buried behind some of the young emerging guys here, even though he's, I think he thrived in that under the radar role last year, but is he in a position where he can be under the radar this year? I don't think that's the case. And then Brandon Johnson, and I want to apologize to Brandon Johnson here, Sayre, because I feel like with all the wide receivers we've talked about this offseason, we probably haven't talked about Brandon Johnson quite a bit, a guy who caught several touchdowns last year. I know he dealt with some injuries. He's made the active roster 2 years in a row as an undrafted guy. He's kind of just been putting his head down and working, which I like. You don't see him broadcasting anything. He just grinds. I think he is also a guy that's going to make an argument here coming up, especially as we start to figure out how many wide receivers the Broncos are going to keep here. Johnson's a name to keep an eye on in terms of maybe one of the back-end guys to make the 53-man roster. But that really kind of sets things up here, though, Sayre. How is the Broncos 53-man roster going to play out at wide receiver specifically? How many guys do we think that they're going to keep this upcoming season? I know you and I have our picks. We'll share who we think will be practice squad eligible for them this upcoming season. And you're going to get that here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode of the show, we'll break down who we believe will make the 53-man roster a wide receiver for the Broncos. How many players might they keep at that position? Is it going to be 5? Is it going to be 6? Is it going to be 7? Could there be 8 players? You never know in the scheme of the National Football League here, but the Broncos have a lot of players at this position. If everybody stays healthy in training camp, it will create some interesting questions and maybe some problems, good problems to have here for the Broncos going forward. Real quick, I want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day. Every single day. You can subscribe to us for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. We appreciate you so much to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. All right, Sayre, let's dive into this. And look, Broncos Country, we want to hear from you. Participate along and share your 53-man projections at this position as well. How many wide receivers do you think that the Broncos are going to keep this upcoming season, Sayre? Because I feel like you can make an argument for 5. You can make an argument for 6. You could also make an argument for maybe 7 players with the new kickoff rules that have been implemented around the National Football League. So where are you leaning specifically and who?
I feel like the sweet spot for this team as currently constructed would be 6 players. And we talked about the top 4 guys, I think really set in stone. I would say even the top 5 probably set in stone based on Troy Franklin's pre-draft grade of a 2nd round grade. Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick, Josh Reynolds, Marvin Mims, and then obviously Troy Franklin rounding out that top 5. To me, that leaves one spot for, I don't know, 8 or 9 guys, like that's just the reality of the situation. And then the Broncos will have to do roster gymnastics to get guys that they want on the practice squad who are going to probably contribute during games, maybe as early as week 1, like we saw little Jordan Humphrey constantly getting shuffled up and down last year. Is that something that Brandon Johnson could do? I don't know. We'll see. I think the 6th guy that I have right now, Cody, is Jalen Virgil, due to the competitive advantage that Sean Payton thinks that his team can have with the new kickoff return rules. Jalen Virgil is one of the top return men on this team. Now, guys are going to have to go out and prove it during preseason and things like that. They're going to have to impress on practice tape. But to me, you've got 3 potential all-pro return guys with Marvin Mims, Tremont Smith, who we'll talk about in the cornerback episode down the line, as well as Jalen Virgil. And one of those guys also has to return punts. And so it's one of those situations that can you really sacrifice if let's say Mims has to return punts, Cody, because they don't have anybody else reasonably that could do it. then I think you could weaponize Virgil and Tremont Smith on kickoff returns. If you don't want to have Mims returning all the kicks and punts to keep him in the offense and keep him healthy, that to me, that's the deciding factor between all these other receivers who, yeah, some have played really well on offense. Some have even played a little bit of special teams. It's going to be so much less to me about the offensive fit and way more about special teams fit.
I agree with that. And look, my depth chart, how I have it, I have them keeping 6 receivers as well, and I have it the same exact order as you have it. Those are the guys leading out with Jalen Virgil. Though I feel like, can you make an argument like there's going to be guys like who's Jalen going to be competing against? He's going to be competing against Devon Vele, David Sills. He's going to be competing against Lil Jordan Humphrey, Brandon Johnson, Michael Bandy, Philip Dorsett. Like there's a lot of competition, really. If we're talking about 6, there are a lot of guys fighting for that 6th spot. I think we already have the 5 guys in mind, as you mentioned, with obviously Troy Franklin being the 5th. It makes the challenge a little bit more difficult to evaluate, right? Because it's not just about like even the return aspect, but okay, who's playing gunner? Who's playing jammer? Who's playing, some of the internal roles on the punt team or even setting things up there? Like there's so much that goes into it. And I do think that this year you're probably going to see an increased emphasis on, okay, this guy's obviously, outside of your defensive studs, right? You're like your starters or offensive studs. You need a lot of guys to play both ways, like whether that's offense and special teams or defense and special teams. Like they have to be able to contribute in more facets than just one if they're not considered necessarily a star player. Not going to really see Patrick Surtain playing any defensive special team snaps really outside of field goal block. You're not going to see him on punt return. You're not going to see him on punt. You're not going to see him on kickoff. That would be silly, or even kick return for that matter. So you have to find a way to carve out roles for guys who are going to have to do a little bit more than just the position that they play. And I think that's where Jalen Virgil will probably have a little bit of the advantage. I do think it is going to be interesting, though, Sayre. Like, for example, let's say one of these guys in the return game at wide receiver, whether that's Dorsett, whether that's Jalen Virgil, if one of these guys has a return touchdown in the preseason, do you think that locks up a roster spot? More so because of what you mentioned there. Like it may not be as valuable for them to, be on the offensive side, especially if everybody's healthy, but because of the fact that, hey, okay, this guy took one to the house in the preseason, we need to find a way to keep him. I find that dilemma to be very interesting. Though I will say this as well, Sayre, the NFL is trending towards having 18 regular season games, eliminating one preseason game. I want to ask you a question. It's really kind of not on script here, but maybe we'll have something to tie into this in the future, in the near future to be exact. Do you think that if they eliminate another preseason game, which you and I believe are like preseason is so important for your young guys, you want to see who you have, you eliminate that, does it make it easier to maybe keep some of these guys that can be good players for you that aren't going to get as much preseason audition in the coming falls? Like I think that's a really interesting dynamic to throw out, especially at a position like receiver.
It really makes your practices and the practice tape a lot more valuable and important, and certainly would ramp up, I think, the interest of teams to do more joint practices, because those preseason games are game situations. Like, yes, a guy could, if he strings together a bunch of bad practices, I mean, that would be a red flag. But let's say there's a close competition, like big plays in a game could set somebody apart. And if you take a game away, that can really be, Sean Payton always talks about, you want to arrive at the right 53, and that can take away an evaluation opportunity to do exactly that. So you've got to be sure that you're sure in a way. So I do think so. And I think when you talk about the question of whether or not a return touchdown in the preseason would dictate a roster spot, I think there's merit to that, because Sean Payton he said that he thinks there could be upwards of 12 kickoff return touchdowns across the league this year. You better believe that he thinks he's getting at least 1 or 2, right? So yeah, how many in the preseason will we see as teams adjust to these new rules and things like that? I think it does set a guy apart to be able to do that, because like you said, anything that you can do on special teams is going to be valuable in the NFL when you're talking about different coverage units, or if you're talking about returning kicks. But the kickoff return aspect has just been given a violent shove into you could get, what did Robert Saleh say earlier this offseason? He thinks that teams could have upwards of 100 kickoff return opportunities this season. That's a lot of touch. Think about that in terms of an offensive player. There was 3-4 guys on the Broncos roster last year that had 100 touches total. That's a lot of touches for a player that you have to be able to trust and that you believe can be a difference maker in a game. So if a guy proves that in the preseason, even on just one play, I think that does loom very large when it comes to overall roster factor.
I've already talked to a lot of players about an 18th regular season game and taking away a preseason game. They hate it. They think it's a terrible idea, which I agree. I mean, especially for the young guys who need those 3 games to really make their case, right? Let's say you get one good game from them, but what about the 2 other games? Can you do it in back-to-back-to-back weeks? Like, can you stack that? And it reduces those opportunities, but I think it maximizes the benefit here for your pro and scouting department. Is like, we see these guys in practice every day. We know there's not going to be a lot of tape on them, so they can clear waivers. We'll have a great idea about that. And then, maybe we can build a really strong practice squad if they don't make the 53. And obviously that's going to factor in there. I do think that we'll close off today's show. I think really Denver's practice squad candidates, if the active roster goes as you may, like the 6 receivers, Tim Patrick, Courtland Sutton, Marvin Mims, Josh Reynolds, obviously Troy Franklin and Jalen Virgil, if they make the 53-man roster, the practice squad, in my opinion, I feel like will be David Sills, little Jordan Humphrey if he wants to return. I think Devon Vele will be a part of that. Philip Dorsett's a little bit of a question mark. I know some people say, what about Brandon Johnson? I think Brandon Johnson will actually be in a position where he ends up on another team because of how he plays in the preseason. And if Denver is unable to keep him, I think he'll land elsewhere overall. So he'll get another opportunity somewhat, maybe even in Pittsburgh, reuniting with Russell Wilson. We'll see if that's the case here. But with that said, Broncos Country, want to hear from you. Who do you think will round out your receivers on this roster? It could be 5, 6, 7, or maybe even 8 players. Let us know if you're watching on YouTube or listening wherever you get your podcasts. Our training camp position preview series continues tomorrow as we talk about the tight end position. Lucas Kroll seems like he's the number 1 option. We'll tell you what he has to do to hold on to that in training camp on tomorrow's brand new episode of the show.